In this lecture, I'm going to finish up by talking about how modern historians have grappled with the whole area often called postmodernism, questions of how we can know about the past and questions of how we set about representing it. It has to be said that the word postmodernism is not itself hugely useful to us as historians. It confuses a number of things to do with literary production and theories about modern culture with a rather longer discussion about theories of knowledge. Nonetheless, it will do because it's a word that people have brought into the discussion. The way that I want to set about doing this is to focus briefly on three key postmodern writers, although I think none of the three of them would actually recognise that term as applying to them. These three people are Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida and Hayden White. And they show us different aspects of the challenges of postmodernism for the practices of history. And I can talk about some ways in which those challenges have been met and taken forward. So Michel Foucault, first of all. Foucault, French philosopher, historian and writer, in some ways develops an approach to history very much informed by the Annales school that I was talking about earlier. That is an imaginatively broad approach that sees the possibility of asking very different questions about the past. What's important to Foucault is the past power of language. Language, discourse as he calls it, the ways in which language not only represents the world around us, but actually forms and creates it, as he would see it. So Foucault, in one of his early books, wrote about madness, about the ways in which the mad had been treated historically, and emphasises and demonstrates that the ways in which the mad were talked about and discussed, the sort of logics under which the mad were represented, were essentially constitutive of madness itself. That being mad didn't precede being discussed as a mad person, but was formed in the very process of doing it. What preceded being mad might well be acting differently, being disturbed, being unhappy, but the concept and the category of madness as such is one formed through language and power. And that's really what Foucault emphasises in all of his work, that language and power go together, that the ways in which we describe the world is a key part of how the world takes on its particular, usually unequal shape. And when Foucault looks at the passage of human history, what he emphasises is that things that we might treat as sort of steps forward, progressions in civilization, often carry with them elements that we still need to question in terms of the exercise of power. An example here is the treatment of prisoners. He talks about how the punishment of people in early modern times was usually brutal and very public, whereas in modern times we've moved to imprisoning people and trying to reform them. What he emphasises is the exercise of power that continues within that process of reform, the ways in which prisons are organised spatially, the ways in which prisoners are required to do and think and act in certain ways. And he suggests that some of those ways of thinking about imprisonment spilled out into wider society more generally, into schools and hospitals, into ways in which we're taught how to be good, obedient citizens. So Foucault's all about language and power and about how the very object of our study is constituted by language in the past. And he emphasises also that when he comes to write histories, he's interested in the critical work that they can do in the present. He talks about a critical and effective history that seeks to change the world that we're now in rather than simply represent the past. The next figure, one who knew Foucault, although in fact they often disagreed on many things, is Jacques Derrida. Now Derrida really is a philosopher reflecting on language. He didn't have very much to say per se about history itself. The emphasis that Derrida makes, however, is that language does not have any secure reference outside itself. If we want to talk about how language and all the things that language therefore gives us about logic and truth and our understanding of the world, we cannot secure these into a stable system of meaning by reference beyond language. There's a famous saying he has in French, il n'y a pas de hors texte. There is no outside the text. Everything is ultimately language and in flux. What that has meant for historians, or has been taken to mean, is that claims that we might make about the past are always radically unstable. That we are dealing with textual documents, that we're dealing with representation of the past, that we can't fix it into one secure, stable claim to truth, and that historians, others who've developed the idea beyond Derrida, that historians need to admit that they are making up a lot of the claims that they make about the past in that sense, not making it up from nothing, but making it up in the sense of claiming that it has some fixity, which in reality it lacks. The third person I mentioned is Hayden White, American historian interested in how historians write history, influenced in part by some of Derrida's writings as well. Hayden White wrote a rather lengthy book called Meta-History, which reflects on the shape of the histories written by various 19th century historians. And White emphasised that when we as historians come to write down our histories, when we come to produce a book or an article or whatever, we are actively making choices and creating prose narratives that have meaning embedded in them. And that as historians we ought to reflect much more actively on how that meaning works. That is, if you have 4 events that you're going to talk about and you emphasise the third of those events above the others, that produces a certain shape to your narrative, whether or not you wittingly intended to do so or not. And White said that history, the doing of history, is a prose discourse as much invented as found. That is, how history actually works as an academic discipline is the act of creation by modern historians. Now, there was a period of time in the late 90s when historians got very agitated about all 3 of these aspects, sometimes confusing them together, sometimes rebutting one aspect but accepting others. That debate at times got extremely heated. People wanted to defend history from what they saw as a major threat to it. It has to be said, for most practicing historians, elements of this simply got accepted into their means of operation. So many historians now will accept some element of Foucault's insight into language, that the ways in which things are represented in the past, the ways in which we talk about existence, is part of how existence is constituted. Historians have in fact long accepted that they cannot go back into the past and check the truth of what actually happened against their claims for it. And in that sense, some of the challenge of Derrida and elements of Hayden White have always been there and have always been recognised. How much we worry about it is a question of how much we think the worrying is helpful. We've probably been least good at really picking up the challenge of Hayden White in reflecting on how we write history. There are still expectations within academic history that we fulfil, and modern popular histories tend to fall into certain narrative shapes as well. But some people have experimented with different ways of writing history, and there is some utility to that. We may find more exciting ways of reflecting on the story that we tell about the past. In all of this, there is a very strong sense in which we are concerned with the essence of why history matters, that reflecting on the past is still of concern for us. And going back to Michel Foucault, even as he made much more fluid and unstable a lot of our claims about the past, he was again emphatic that one needed to write critical and effective histories to address moments in the present. The last thing to say about postmodernism is that it has to some degree always been there. Although it emerges out of the 60s, 70s and 80s writings, particularly by French philosophers, these challenges of what it means to do history are perhaps innate to the very task itself. So I'm going to finish by reading you a brief extract of one historian reflecting on that task of history. History, this historian says, history on its surface is no more than information about political events, dynasties and occurrences of the remote past, elegantly presented and spiced with proverbs. It serves to entertain large crowded gatherings and brings us to an understanding of human affairs. It shows how changing conditions affected human affairs, how certain dynasties came to occupy an ever wider space in the world, and how they settled the earth until they heard the call and their time was up. The inner meaning of history, on the other hand, involves speculation and an attempt to get at the truth, subtle explanation of the causes and origins of existing things, and deep knowledge of the how and why of events. History, therefore, is firmly rooted in philosophy. History is firmly rooted in philosophy. Those are words, in fact, of Ibn Khaldun, an Islamic historian writing in the 14th century, reflecting on the distant past of his own time. In all of these talks, what I've tried to emphasise is that whilst the doing of history has changed very considerably from ancient to modern times, there are elements which have remained with us all the way through. The challenges of history that all historians have to face, including those studying history at school.